Hello and welcome. My name is Theresa Notare, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Natural Family Planning Program of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And today we're having another conversation, our conversations with natural family planning leaders. And we have a wonderful special guest today who I'm so happy to introduce to you, and that is Dr. Mary Shivanandan. Mary, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm happy to. And I was born in Burma, and I was sent at a very young age to England. And I was really only a year and a half old, and my brother and sister went with me. And usually children were sent from India at the age of 7.
Oh, wow.
Then at the age of 8, we were all shipped to Australia. Our parents remained in India, and they thought that we could get to there for vacations. And of course, the Japanese came into the war, and so we were separated from them. And so that this had a profound effect on my life.
Wow.
And eventually, I married someone from Sri Lanka who actually was he had been brought up in Malaysia, and he was in Australia and was in Canada. So it was really like marrying the boy next door. But yes, but this is rather an unusual background.
So you basically had an East versus an East meets West marriage. And can I ask what years? When did you get married? What year was it?
We were married in 1960, and it wasn't at all common to marry somebody from another culture at that time. And it was difficult, both for his family and for my family. And that the church did say that was okay. And so that had a strong influence on me as to choosing natural family planning. I thought the church must be right about the importance of the family.
Well, we'll get back to talking about your marriage, because I have to say I find that so interesting, especially getting married at a time to somebody who is so different from you, during a day and age when people just didn't even think like that. But on to the topic of church teaching, do you remember when you first heard about Catholic Church teaching regarding birth control and the moral use of a method like the methods of natural family planning?
Well, very little was known at that time, and the most of what was known was the basal body temperature method. And I do remember that it wasn't very successful, and we got pregnant. I was very happy within 3 months of marriage, and then when our son was a year old, I thought that it would be a good idea to go to England and to introduce our son to the English family, the family in England, and the family in Sri Lanka. And so I did. That was what I did. And I do think that that was very helpful to our marriage. And it also, I did go and visit Dr. John Rock's clinic at that time, and was very impressed that he wanted to experiment with me. And I said no. And so then I went to the Protestant assistant to learn more about natural family planning. And he said the church will never change its teaching. And that was.
Can you back up a little bit, Mary? First of all, you and your husband were living in the United States when you got married, correct?
Yes, we got married in Canada And then we immediately came to the United States because he was at MIT at the time, and eventually he became an astrophysicist.
Mm. And in terms of Dr. John Rock, isn't he the Catholic doctor who was part of the team that worked on the chemical contraceptive pill, correct?
Yes, he was.
So
And
what kind of clinic did he have?
he had a basal body temperature clinic because he was keeping one foot in the church, and while he was doing this experimenting.
And he had asked you to be part of those early trials of chemical
He
contraception?
asked me to be part of the early trials, and I said no. I wanted to learn natural methods of family planning.
Mm.
And so that was when he sent me to his Protestant assistant, who had 5 children, and he said that the church would never change its teaching.
And what did you know about church teaching at that time?
Well, I knew very little, actually. And I would have to say that even though I believe what the church has said, I think that Billings only came to the United States in 1970s, and I never really learned the mucus method.
Mhm.
And so we managed with the basal body temperature method, and then of course that was developed further by the couple to couple league.
Right, and other symptothermal leaders, that's correct. But then Mary, in your journey, it sounds like you became involved in natural family planning in the beginning, just purely based on faith. But what happened in your life that gave you that spark of interest where you started digging deeper into the teachings?
Well, I think I would have to say because of my interest in marriage itself.
Mhm.
And so that really most of my work was done in holistically with marriage itself. And eventually, I did do some work with Dr. Thomasina Borkman, who is a sociologist, and she's not Catholic. And we, in terms of communication and natural family planning, and that is very important in marriage.
Right. And were you, by education, were you a journalist? Can you tell us a little bit about what your training was in?
Well, yes, I went to Cambridge University and I did classics, which was actually very helpful later because the Greek philosophy was very much on the natural, the law of nature. And that is very important in natural family planning. And then I went to the BBC and I went to the CBC in Canada. And so I worked for many years with the radio in Canada. And that gave me a really a bird's eye view of everything that was happening in the world.
Mhm, mhm. And when did you start digging into church teaching? Do you remember, for example, in 1968, picking up Humanae Vitae, Pope Paul VI encyclical, and reading it?
Well, yes, I was very, very happy at that time. I was a member of Washington Independent Writers, and one of the members had got in touch with me and suggested that I should write something. And I was doing something about a natural family planning program in Washington, and so he suggested that I write a book called Natural Sex, and this was towards the end of this was the end of the 70s, and there was real concern about the effect of the hormones in the pill. And so he called it natural sex, and I got a $15,000 advance. And at that time, there were 3 natural family planning conferences going on across the country. So it was absolutely providential that I was able to go to all 3 and to interview the couples who were practicing natural family planning. And also there was a program, a conference in Colombia, Cali, Colombia. And so I attended that also, and I met a lot of the leaders of the natural family planning movement there, including Ingrid Trobisch, and I think it was put on by Claude Langto, who was the International Federation for Family Life Promotion. And so that was wonderfully helpful. Now, that's very interesting because I was writing it just before John Paul II was elected. Mm-hmm. And of course, John Paul I was elected. And I remember going to a neighbor who was very much in favor of artificial contraception. And she kept calling me and telling me the church was going to change its teaching. And so I thought, well, I think this is too difficult for me because I've got a deadline. And I went over to her house and she threw me out of the house. But I think that was very helpful because I eventually went to New York and the book was ready for publication. And so we were talking about the publicity for it. And one of the public publicity agents was particularly concerned because I had only one chapter on the spiritual aspects, and she put her hand on it as if it might burn her, and she said, "Oh, well, this has God in it. We don't publish anything with God in it." And then it was published by Berkeley. The title that was given to it was Natural Sex. And so I was sent to England. And by that time, the feminists had got hold of natural methods and had rejected them. So then I went to Ireland, and there was still an openness in Ireland to natural methods of family planning. But of course now the situation has changed even there. But I would say that was the time that natural methods were not adopted any longer by the public sector.
So when you had mentioned the feminist leaders, so the American and British feminist leaders already politicized the methods. So I know that by time I jumped on board in this community in the 1980s, I knew that pretty much secular feminists viewed this as a Catholic issue and not as an empowerment of women issue. So is that what you're talking about?
Well, yes. And USAID, there was a lot of money that was available from USAID for promoting the natural methods. And Claude Langto, with his International Federation, did apply for it, but he was Canadian, so he was rejected. So that then it became a Georgetown effect, and they did attempt to promote it, but they didn't promote it in a really positive way that was true natural family planning.
Right, right. I know the history of that, and I was told by people who were there with all those negotiations that various leaders in USAID decided that they needed to get behind some hardcore research on natural family planning methods, but they didn't trust the Catholic leaders who were clearly doing it because of the philosophy and the spiritual truths that that we accept, that is part of why we went down that road. So rather than going to Dr. Claude Langto or doctors John and Evelyn Billings, or even Dr. Joseph Retzer, instead they cast a net wide for family planning researchers and came up with a team who basically built the program, the international, no, I think it's called the Institute for Reproductive Health at Georgetown University. It was first called the Natural Family Planning Institute at Georgetown, of Reproductive Health at Georgetown University, but they changed that later to sound even more secular. Their contribution has been to do research on the methods in nations, more, poorer nations who are in development. So I know that that's where they did their research. But they did it from a completely contraceptive perspective, looking for pregnancy avoidance rather than even looking at achieving pregnancy in addition to avoiding pregnancy. So you're right, they were completely different and not really in the same step, I would say, as the other natural family planning leaders. But that leads me to consider, who were your heroes at the time? Did you have any natural family planning leaders who really inspired you?
Well, I do think that Claude Langto was one, and Ingrid Trobrisch was another. She and her husband had been in Africa as missionaries, and they had written books. And then they, of course, were focused more on the marriage side of things, which I was interested in too. And Gagnon, Cardinal Gagnon, was very, very appreciative of my writing in natural family planning. And in fact, Anne Langto, she suggested that I go to the Institute. And it had never occurred to me to do theology, and how I could do marriage without theology, I don't know. But anyway, so I thought, well, it hasn't occurred to me to do that. My husband had just completed his doctorate in physics, and I thought that's enough to put the family through. So I waited a year, and then Dr. Cardinal Gagnon just happened to come into Washington, D.C. at that time. And I thought, well, if I don't apply, I will never know. I won't give them the opportunity to say no. And so I thought, well, let me ask Cardinal Gagnon for a recommendation. And he was happy to give it. And so I was accepted. And
Mary, let me interrupt. Remind me, Cardinal Gagnon, was he head of the Pontifical Council on the Family at that
Yes,
time?
he
He
was.
was, right,
Yes,
right.
yes, yes, he was.
And
And
and the institute you're talking about is the John Paul II Institute for
yes,
Studies on Marriage and the Family.
yes.
Right.
And the second year that I was there as a student, I proposed that I should teach a course on natural family planning. And so I did start to teach that, the theology of natural family planning.
Mm-hmm. Right,
And
right.
I will have to say that I wasn't very good.
Are you talking about your inexperience at that time and trying to get used to the teaching mode? Is that what
Well,
you mean?
yes, I really didn't have enough background to teach the theological side of it. But the theological side of it was not really well developed until John Paul II came along.
Right, right,
And so his theology of the body, I was very fortunate that Professor Kenneth Smith was my thesis advisor, and he wrote the first book on gift about
wow.
John Paul II's work. And so then I did write Crossing the Threshold of Love in the 1990s.
Right.
About John Paul II's theology of the body.
Was your book Crossing the Threshold of Love, was that a result from your studies? Was it your dissertation or something different?
Well, from that, um, I was still teaching the natural family planning course until the year 2000, and I found it in the last half of Crossing the Threshold of Love is full of information about natural family planning and how it jibed well with John Paul II's theology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, right. Well, that book really it was pivotal for a lot of people to use at the time because not much was accessible for the average Catholic. And your book really unpacked it in a very readable way. I know Christopher West, who came along, he was one of your students, wasn't he, at the Institute when
He
he
was at
studied
the
there?
Institute, but he didn't go beyond the master's program. So he was not very well accepted uh,
At the
from
time, right.
at the time,
Yeah,
yes, but he has been very successful in promoting natural family planning.
right, right,
And he's been very successful in promoting the theology of the body.
right,
And so,
right.
and we did have a program called A New Language, which was using the experiential model of John Paul II,
Hmm.
and that was quite successful for many years.
Right, right. Well, it was connected to that lovely Imago Dei um, program that you had as well, wasn't it?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Imago Dei was an organization that came out of Women Affirming Life
Hmm.
and did promote a new language. But now we'll have to see where it goes next.
Right, exactly. I'd like to go back to your marriage because, having a marriage, East meets West, two totally different cultures. Um, and you were two different religions, weren't you? Your husband was Hindu, wasn't he? When you were
Well,
Catholic.
it was very interesting that he wrote his autobiography, and he didn't choose scientists to be the prime movers of the 20th century. He chose Gandhi and Paul VI,
Ah,
particularly for Humani Vitae. And
wow.
I think for a scientist to do that is very impressive.
Mary, could you share a little bit with us about his conversion experience? Because I'm sure our viewers would be interested in that.
Well, he did think it was very effective, and so in our case, I would have liked more children, but he was very much um, from a developing country, and so that the pressure on the developing countries was to have as fewer children as possible.
Wow.
So, but he did, and this is one of the problems about natural family planning. It is very effective, and so it is rejected by traditional Catholics who think that you should be able to have as many children as possible. And I always remember a, um, a prelate in Argentina at a conference that I attended in Argentina, who said, be sure that the number of your children reflects your love and not your lack of self-control.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So those teachings must have struck a chord in his heart, in your husband's heart.
Yes. Well, I think that we have to recognize that natural family planning can be hard, and it does demand a lot of the men.
Mhm.
And but the rewards can be very great.
Mhm.
The rewards can be very great. And I think that women, and my experience of not having a home life was very important in not going wholesale for the feminist movement, because I do think the feminists have rejected motherhood. And part of that is because of the difficulties of motherhood. And they don't want to accept that.
Mhm. Right, right. So, do you have concerns for the future then, regarding communicating these teachings and inspiring couples to embrace God's plan for married love? What would you tell? What would you tell young adults today?
Well, I think that they should not look on natural family planning as purely a, um, a question of controlling births. They need to look on it as a pro-life, as
Right,
for the family and for children, uh, and um, and I think that it should be taught with breastfeeding also.
hmm right,
I think that it shouldn't be taught, uh, it should be taught in a holistic way, that it's all about the family, and it's about developing the person in the best way possible.
right. That's one of the things we keep trying to do in our national programs, as we develop resources for the dioceses, to lead with church teaching, because what is church teaching but God's gifts to us? How God made men and women, how He made marriage, how He gave the procreative gift, that sharing in His ability to create a new soul, a new person for the world and for eternity. He gave that responsibility to parents, to husband and wife in marriage. And I think that you're right. People need to bring those ideas together again, and remember that marriage, it's bigger than the couple. It's about the future. It's about
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, it is very much about the future. but I think that the ease of contraception is going to be very difficult to challenge.
Yeah.
And it's too easy for people to adopt.
Right.
And of course, I think that it has a strong effect on evangelization,
Sure.
because it helps the woman to respect herself.
Hmm.
And I think that this is very difficult in developing countries.
Right.
That
Right.
that it has to be taught that the woman has a value.
Right. The founder of the Bishop's NFP program, Bishop James McHugh, he used to say to all of us who were working with him that we are trying to get the man to integrate the woman's cycle in his very person, to understand how he's made, but how she's made, and to value how she's made, so that he can work with her sexuality besides his. uh, I remember the first time that I learned about church teaching and these methods, I thought, holy smokes, this is revolutionary. This can really heal any type of problems between men and women, as long as the both of them have hearts open to each other and to God's will. It's true.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I do think and I would have to say that being married to my husband, because it was unusual, and it required a certain amount of character to do that, it helped me in a way to foster natural family planning, and also uh, to be in favor of the child,
Right.
because I do think that contraception is not in favor of the child.
No, not at all. It actually denies the child. For those of us who don't know too much about natural family planning, that is the umbrella term for these various different methods that teach a woman how to identify her signs of fertility. And per each method, there are guidelines, all based on research, as to how to identify the woman's time of fertility, and the woman with the man in marriage, the husband and wife, their combined fertility gives them a window of fertility. So couples can know then when is the best time to try to attempt a pregnancy, or the best time to possibly avoid a pregnancy. And the NFP means for avoiding a pregnancy is periodic sexual abstinence. So it can be very challenging. But as many NFP couples say, it is worth the challenge, isn't it?
Well, yes, I do think that it's a sacrifice on the part of the man and on the part of the woman to forego conjugal intercourse, especially nowadays when the whole thrust is not to is on enjoying the physical
That's right.
sexual relationship, and in fact, it interferes with other relationship.
Right, right, right. Well, Mary, thank you so much. Oh, I should ask you one thing before we close, and that is, I know you're not actively teaching any longer at the John Paul II Institute. So how are you spending your time these days?
Well, I, I am spending my time because reviewing books because I wrote this book called The Holy Family Model Not Exception. And that has been very well received by various people. And so that they are sending me their books for endorsement. And so I'm very busy. And and then I'm happy to do this interview with you.
Sure, sure. And I'm very grateful, very grateful. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.